Good morning. So as you just saw, we're going to be talking about the LGBT population. But let's specifically think about the LGBT youth that are served here, that are represented here in the organizations here today. We want to think about and recognize how far we've come, but we also want to talk and think about how far we need to go, okay? So to begin this morning, to get you guys talking, and it's very early, we want to start with a question and answer session, just a couple questions. So you can either shout out the answers if you want to, whatever you feel comfortable with, or you can raise your hands, okay? But I definitely want you to talk back to me. And we want to just start thinking about the youth that we serve, all right? So the first question, how many of you have ever thought or know someone who's thought this sentiment? How do we know if the youth that we're serving is gay or straight? I mean, they're only 13 or 14 or 15. How do we know it's not just a phase that they're going through and they're going to grow out of it? How many of you have thought that or know someone who's thought that? Okay, all right. All right, next question. How many of you are or know a colleague who may be uncomfortable talking or thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity of the youth that you serve? Okay, you can speak a little louder. Helps if you talk back to me a little bit. Okay, so the other day my colleague was telling me that gay men that act feminine make him uncomfortable. He said he doesn't know why, he can't articulate it, it just makes him uncomfortable. How many of you have ever thought that or know someone who has thought that or expressed that idea? Yeah. And I think it's the statement that my friend made that has really been the driving force for me with my interest in and work on behalf of LGBT youth, specifically in the juvenile justice system, because that's just not where I came from. So I come from a middle-class community where things like differences in race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity were not things that were openly discussed. You know, I kind of grew up in that colorblind society, where, in my schools and in my community, you were either black, white, Latino, everybody was Christian, and pretty much everybody was the same. So there were no opportunities to recognize that people were different, and have those conversations and learn about those differences. So I went away to college and I decided to study psychology. And I remember in my abnormal psych class, I was just fascinated with learning about the disorders in the DSM. But when we got to the disorder of gender identity disorder, I was really, really intrigued. And now in the DSM-5, it's gender dysphoria. And so I think what intrigued me the most was the negativity that people express or the negativity that people feel about specifically transgender people, but also lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Because again, I wasn't taught that. That's foreign to me. So, and I think as we have seen with President Obama's speech and the Supreme Court allowing same-sex marriage, and then we've got Caitlyn Jenner accepting an ESPY award and coming out as a transgender female, and Laverne Cox starring on Orange is the New Black. I think we've seen that our society has come a little ways as far as the trans community and trans identities, and they're more visible, I think, in our community. But I also feel like we still have a ways to go, because I still feel that overt hate and negativity. I still see that expressed, particularly in spaces of social media. And I think we've all seen that with all of those developments I just talked about. It really is interesting to me what people are willing to say, under the cover of Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. So I still remain intrigued. I still feel like we got a ways to go. Okay, so let me get back to my background a little bit. So I decided to go on to graduate school and study public administration. And once I earned my degree in public administration, I definitely think that I became a social justice nerd. So I still am a social justice nerd, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. I'm really interested in the different ways in which we identify ourselves and how people perceive those identities and how our laws and our policies and our programs are shaped by that. Like, how are our institutions shaped? How do institutions interact with each other, and how do we interact with each other based on our perceptions of the different ways in which we identify ourselves? But then I went on to get a second master's in community counseling. And by the time I earned that degree, I was already working in the juvenile justice system on behalf of LGBT youth and working specifically on conditions of confinement. And so what I've learned traveling around the country and having conversations about LGBT youth over and over again, what I've learned is that professionals seem to be able to understand and kind of get their minds around youth that identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It's really the identity of identifying as transgender or gender nonconforming that folks seem to still struggle with the most, right? I mean, do you guys feel that as well? Yeah, I mean, I think, as I've had these conversations, professionals can say, well, I get, same-sex relationships, but I just don't get how you can think of yourself, as something that you're not, maybe. So I think that when we think about the identities of being lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and then the identity of transgender or expressing oneself in a gender nonconforming way, the distinctions of those identities are important because we all know that trans kids are not necessarily gay kids are not necessarily trans, and expressing oneself in a gender nonconforming way often or may not have anything to do with your sexual orientation or your gender identity. So while we know that sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are all different ways in which we identify ourselves, those definitions are not the same, we also know that those identities do create similar vulnerabilities in our youth. So LGBT youth are at higher risk for being bullied, for committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide, for involvement with the juvenile justice system, or just interacting with law enforcement in general. They're at higher risk for being marginalized in society, at higher risk for being isolated in their schools, in places of worship, in their communities, and even from their families. So today, in our conversations here in Connections 2015, and when we go back to our organizations, I want us to really think and start talking about what is it about our organizations that may inadvertently create or exacerbate those risks. What are we doing? What can we do different? So some of you might be thinking, well, having those conversations and thinking about that might not necessarily apply to us because we don't have transgender youth or gender nonconforming youth in our programs, or we might just have one or two, right? So I want to challenge you with these questions. Is it that you don't have transgender or gender nonconforming youth in your programs because your demographic data says that you don't? Or do you not have transgender and gender nonconforming youth in your programs because you've never asked? Do you ask youth how they identify themselves in a gendered way? Or maybe you do ask, and maybe your organizational culture is organized in such a way that youth may not feel comfortable disclosing their trans or gender nonconforming identity to their caseworker or treatment provider in some way. But to think a little bit deeper about it, I'll give you an example in the juvenile justice system, and really in most systems. So we house youth in a sex-segregated way. So if you have male genitalia, you're housed with the boys. If you have female genitalia, you're housed with the girls, right? So what does that really mean, though, for a trans youth? Who gets to make the decisions on where they're housed? How are those decisions made? What factors are you using to make those decisions? And then if you house a transgender female, for example, with an all-male population, what kind of risks does that place on the transgender female and all the rest of the residents in the facility? So what are we doing? I think we have an opportunity as thought leaders and change agents to really start asking ourselves those questions. And even though we can be very well-intentioned, what is it about our policies and our procedures and our programs that creates invisibility amongst transgender and gender nonconforming youth, at best, or maybe inadvertently increases risk of safety. And not just their physical safety, their emotional safety and their sexual safety as well. So when I first came out here, I was nervous, but I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable, okay? So I want to disclose something to you. I want to be honest with you all today. I identify as transgender. So I was born with a penis. So I can see some of your reactions. Somebody over here, his head just went up real subtly, just like, oh, interesting. I can just tell, like, the atmosphere in the room changed a little bit. Some knowing smiles to each other. So let me ask you a couple more questions. The same rules apply. Shout them out or raise your hands, whatever you feel comfortable with. You're not going to offend me or hurt my feelings, but I want to process this a little bit. So how many of you may have thought, when I disclosed my identity to you, oh, well, good for her. I wouldn't have known that. That's pretty courageous, talking about her identity in the room full of people she doesn't know. How many of you thought that? Okay, well, thank you. How many of you might have thought, wait, what? Did she just say she had a penis? I thought she was a woman. Or maybe some of you might have thought, and I appreciate you, Ray. Thank you for being honest. I appreciate that. How many of you might have thought, we just saw President Obama talking about LGBT, the LGBT population, and we're talking about LGBT youth, and her name is Mykel, so I knew she was a man. I knew it. Or maybe I just suspected she was born a man. How many of you might have thought that? Okay, I appreciate your honesty. Thank you. So no matter what you thought, did the disclosure of my identity change anything about what I've told you so far? Did it make me any less credible? Did it make anything I said less true? Did it change anything about my background or my education or my professional experience? Okay. For real though, for real. I identify as a cisgender heterosexual woman. Okay, so cisgender means I was born a female with a vagina. I identify as a female with respect to my gender identity, and I also express myself as female. But I have the privilege of clarifying my identity to you and making sure that you know before you walk out that door that I'm in alignment with the majority of the population. But what if I wasn't? What if I didn't have that privilege? What if I were a youth in your organization that just disclosed my identity to you? How would that change? So as thought leaders and as change agents, as I said, we have that privilege. We have the power to be able to listen to transgender youth and gender nonconforming youth, listen to their stories, and understand that just identifying as transgender and gender nonconforming may have created situations and experiences in which they have been harmed. We have the opportunity to change our policies and our programs to account for LGBT and gender nonconforming youth, and specifically transgender youth, by asking how youth identify themselves in a gendered way, and looking at our programs and recognizing that these youth have needs that we may not be always accounting for. We have the opportunity to regard transgender youth as any other youth in our systems. How many identities do our youth have? How many times do they come and identify as one thing, and then a couple weeks later they identify as something else? How many behaviors do they engage in that we may not necessarily agree with and may be able to never get our minds around for various different reasons, but we still figure out ways to meet their needs and to serve them? So why is identifying as transgender and gender nonconforming any different? So we have the opportunity to regard transgender youth as survivors of trauma, as people that are living with mental health disorders instead of suffering from mental health disorders. And they may need your life skills group, your mentoring programs, your individual and group counseling. We can regard them as people that are involved in the juvenile justice system that may need structure and rehabilitation and effective, culturally competent reentry planning. But I think most important, we have the opportunity, we have the power, and we have the privilege to identify and regard transgender and gender nonconforming youth as just simply youth. Thank you very much.